Hello and welcome. My name is Erika Cosme. I am with the Mariners Museum and Park. We are located in Newport News, right near CMU, right down the road from the Virginia Living Museum. If you've never come to see us, great place. We do have outdoor space, and the best part of the Mariners Museum, in my opinion, is that it only costs $1 to get in, so you have very little, I won't say nothing, but very little to lose if you do decide to come through our doors and visit and see some of the stories that we have to share. So today's program, and if at any point during the program, if you cannot see the screen, again, you don't really need to see me as much. But if you can't see the screen, or if we lose sound, please let me know. I want to make sure that everybody sees the content and hears the material as best as possible, but Lord knows technology does what technology wants to do. So here's hoping that it's just a smooth sailing as we do today's presentation. It's called Ancient Waters, and looking at some of the myths, legends, lores, tale coming predominantly out of mythology of the Greek region and of Rome as well. I will say I have a background in classical studies, so it's always fun for me to talk about this stuff. I could go on and on about it, but we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. So essentially, what is mythology? What is a myth? It's really a story, usually a fantastical one that includes characters of superhuman strength or creatures that may or may not have ever existed, and sometimes the hero's journey, sometimes some dark and deep stories in there as well. Most cultures around the globe have their versions of myth. Some people even incorporate religion as mythology, not getting into that or anything, but just this understanding of these stories and fables that are coming from different cultures, specifically Greece in particular. So a lot of these stories were created at a time when people were still trying to understand a lot about the world. They couldn't explain everything. We know so much more about our planet and the universe and everything in between today than we did 5,000-10,000 years ago. So a lot of times these myths and stories are helping to create some meaning or reasoning as to why a place is as it is, or why something isn't what it should be, or why we do things the way we do it. And on the screen is a background image of a temple in Greece, more than likely somewhere, and some cartoon characters of gods and goddesses, as they're a lot of times the main theme or the facilitators of a lot of the themes that are coming from the stories, again, predominantly out of Greek and Roman mythology. There we go. So a lot of what we know about myths coming out of Greece and Rome are going to be left behind to us in a bunch of different types of stories, a lot of which you can see here on the screen. Books that you may or may not be familiar with, like the Iliad, which tells the story of the Trojan War, and its part 2, the Odyssey, which tells the story of Odysseus, who fought in the Trojan War on the side of the Greeks getting home. You have stories like Jason and the Argonauts about the Golden Fleece. You also have other stories or compilations of stories coming out of ancient Greece left behind to us today that tell a little bit about creation, how the ancient Greeks felt things came about, who the gods were, who certain characters were, what role they played, why our planet and our universe is shaped or created the way it is. There are dozens of them left behind to us coming out of ancient Greece in particular. But again, I always like to emphasize that Greece is often the one left best to us, and Rome as well, but they're not the only ones who are doing it. They're not the only ones who have their names and explanations for a lot of the stories or similar themes that are looked at, some in this presentation and some in the books that are shown here on this image. And a lot of these stories are left behind to us today now. You can see them in adapted books like Percy Jackson and books that have also been turned into movies or movies just themselves. Clash of the Titans, which tells the story of Perseus, a hero coming out of Greek mythology, and some creatures that he has to encounter, like the Gorgon Medusa, the famed monster who was cursed with turning people to stone and had the hair of snakes. So this concept of mythology that's left behind to us is not one that's necessarily just old, but it's now a part of pop culture. And again, themes that are very readily accessible in books and movies and television shows and everything in between to us today. I think these are great examples and representations of the impact that these stories and the characters themselves have left behind to us, because although a lot of these stories seem a bit outlandish, I will agree, and we'll look at some of them, so I'll let you be the judge by the end of it all. But a lot of these stories had meaning to the people who were telling them and sharing them back then, and they allow us to have an understanding of how people were thinking back then, what they were looking at and studying and trying to understand. So there is a little bit of an importance to their stories, in addition to just being kind of fun and whimsical in certain cases as well. So again, the main area that we're looking at today is predominantly going to be Greece, but we also have to incorporate a little bit of Rome, city capital of Italy today, but was once the great empire that had really conquered much of the known Western world thousands of years ago. So Greece and Rome and Italy are both situated along the Mediterranean Sea. So the Mediterranean Sea was such an important body of water to ancient cultures of Western region in particular, including parts of North Africa, Western Asia, and Southern Europe, as you can see here on this map. And so because of that, a lot of the themes that are associated with Greek mythology are centered around the water. And because we at the Mariners Museum and Park tell and share stories about cultures on the water and the history of maritime activity, a lot of the stories that we're going to be looking at over the course of this presentation are also going to have a maritime theme to them. However, maritime activity and maritime themes are not the only ones that you can find in Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Norse, Egyptian, Chinese, Polynesian, name a culture. They've got their own stories, and all of them are unique. Some, although, are similar, and they're all really fun to kind of get to learn about, in my opinion. So again, looking a little bit at the maritime gods and goddesses, here on the screen is going to be a family tree of sorts of some of the Greek sea gods. Not all of them are necessarily associated with the ocean, but most of them are. Some of these are going to be a little more centered in themes throughout Greek myth as a whole. I did put in red 3 in particular who tend to be standout maritime gods and goddesses. The first being Pontus, then Oceanus or Oceanus, Oceanus being the Greek name for him, and then Poseidon or Neptune, as he is often more commonly known. So, and then also kind of breaking it down a little bit further, you can see on this family tree that a bunch of different other individuals and groups are associated with these Greek sea gods and goddesses. So it's helping explain how certain sea creatures came about, as you can see there. Also other mythical creatures like nymphs and mermaids and all these other again, fantastical beings that are coming from stories out of Greek mythology. So the first one we're going to look at is Pontus. Pontus is said to have been the first. He's what's called a primordial god. And more than just being a primordial or a god, he's also not just in a human form when you think of maybe the Olympian gods like Zeus and Hera and Ares and others like that. Pontus was said to have been born from the chaos, the darkness. He is one of the original kind of foundations that make up our earth. And he's usually personified via bodies of water. So if you look at the map on the screen, there's an image here showing the Black Sea, and it has its Latin name, Pontus Euxinus, using the term Pontus to reflect this body of water, meaning Pontus himself is an actual physical body of water and not just a human or human-like representation. So he's going to be the first. He's going to be the kind of predecessor to a lot of the other Greek gods that are going to follow in his wake related to the sea and such. He's also going to have a wife that he will wind up marrying, and her name is Thalassa or Thalassa. And in brackets there, I also have her Roman name. When Rome took over much of the Western world, they adopted a lot of Greek and other cultures. However, they use their language, meaning names are going to be a little bit different. And because Latin is what our English language and languages like French and German and such are based on, these Latin names are what we're going to see a lot more often in materials that are left to us. So here's an image, a mosaic left to us of Thalassa. She was said to have been the personification of the Mediterranean Sea. And that's just a really fancy way of saying people associated her as being the physical sea, Mediterranean. You can see here, she kind of looks a little funky. If you notice on top of her head, she's got little claws, kind of maybe crab or lobster legs looking out. And that's how she is envisioned to have looked. If you are not aware, the word thalassophobia comes from her name. That's just a really big fancy word for fear of the deep or the dark ocean that's left to us today. So if you've ever looked out, been to the beach and looked just far in the distance, or been on a ship and you're out and there's no land around, the water is dark, it's a little creepy, you have no idea what's lying underneath the surface and even further down in the depths where things really get kind of spooky. Thalassophobia comes from her name. Again, that personification or representation of Thalassa being the actual water. And again, her Roman name, Mare or Mare, is left to us. So when you look at a lot of older maps like this one here, I love maps, so I'm constantly looking at them. So I acknowledge that maybe not everyone does this on a daily basis. But as you do, or if and or when you do, you'll notice Latin names. And in this case, I pointed out some of the areas where you can see her name, Mare or Mare, represented. So here is the Caspian Sea, and then of course the Mediterranean Sea, using the Latin corresponding name, Mediterranean, and Mare meaning sea. So again, that personification, that Thalassa or Mare, is indeed the waters. We then have Okeanos or Oceanus, where we get the word ocean. It is said that Oceanus, instead of being a primordial in the same sense that Pontus and Thalassa were, Okeanos is actually a Titan. And he's also got a personified form. At a time when the Greeks didn't understand how big the world actually was, they thought that the Mediterranean Sea was at the center of the world, and that the world was indeed surrounded by this great river. And this river bared the name Okeanos or Oceanus. And this was the personification or the physical form believed Oceanus was have to taken. And you can see a statue of him in Italy. just showing more of his physical form there. And this is a map based off of Homer, who was a poet and author who lived about thousands of years ago, around 800 BCE, so before the Common Era. And based on this map, you can once again look and see the Mediterranean at the center of the world, and this great river just completely surrounding it, representing Oceanus there as well. And of course, perhaps the most well-known god of the sea, his Greek name is Poseidon, which I prefer to use most of the time, but a lot of times he is left to us in the form with the name Neptune. Here's an image if you've been down to Virginia Beach, if you are local, for those who are joining us online. This is a statue down, I think it's like 32nd Street or somewhere close near there. And you can see Neptune there holding a Triton. He's got a crown on his head representing that he is indeed commander of the sea and all these sea creatures associated with him. One of the things I should have mentioned with Pontus and Thalassa, the husband and wife duo, is that they are also believed to have been the creators of all of the sea creatures who came after them. So a lot of the things that you're looking at on this statue, the fish, the turtles, the octopi, and everything in between are said to have been part of their creation. And then Neptune ruled the seas, but he didn't just rule the waters. He was also said to be the god of earthquakes, which is something he did a lot. He caused a lot of chaos. He was the god of horses for some reason as well. And Neptune, or Poseidon in Greek, is someone who you did not want on your bad side. Typically, as mariners went out to sea, because Greek had a very large maritime culture. They were fishermen, fishing people. They relied on the sea for so much of their livelihood. And back during a time when people believed in these gods, Poseidon was one in particular who often you wanted to appease or make happy or make sure you didn't anger at the very least. If you're familiar with the story of the Odyssey that I mentioned back at the beginning, Odysseus kind of made Poseidon a little upset. And because of that, it cost him 10 years of just heartache and travel while he was trying to get home after the Trojan War. And as I said, Poseidon is also the god of things like earthquakes as well. And earthquakes are usually the cause for things like tsunamis. So you can see how that kind of correlates. It is said that in the earliest years that the gods were ruling, Zeus had been angered at the humans. And that's just something, the king of the gods happened often. So as punishment, he told his brother Poseidon to cause a great flood and wipe out the human race, save for one husband and wife couple. Very similar to stories that you'll hear in the Christian Bible of Noah and the flood and such. But Poseidon had a lot of great power. And again, he is definitely one of those gods or beings that you did not want on your bad side, because woe be unto you if he was angry and you had to go out to sea, even if you were on the shore. Again, earthquakes and such, they are not just limited to the water. So he is one that you definitely want to make sure is constantly in your good graces. So Poseidon is the king of the waters, the oceans, and the seas, but he didn't do it alone, because behind every great man is, of course, a woman. His wife was Amphitrite. She was what's called a Nereid. It's similar to a nymph. I would encourage you to look a little bit more at some of the other beings coming out of Greek mythology, because we sadly don't have enough time to cover them all today. Amphitrite is her Greek name. Salacia is her Roman name. Salacia actually means the salty one. In this case, not salty because she's upset, but because she's the queen of the sea and the salt waters and such. So you can see an image, figurehead on the left of Poseidon/Neptune, Amphitrite, Salacia on the right, and then in the middle is them on a chariot pulled by horses, showing their ruling as husband and wife of the sea. They are also the parents to other sea creatures, including mermaids, one of which is Triton. So if you're familiar with The Little Mermaid, Disney's version, you might remember King Triton, who was indeed a mermaid. So again, pop culture references, whether you knew it or not, they're there. I love it. And so one of the other things that I mentioned, in addition to there being gods and goddesses who controlled or ruled over the seas or were the seas and waters themselves, there's some really unique creatures that also came out of Greek mythology. This is a print from our collection, and the figure that I have circled here is called an ichthyocentaur. That's always a fun word to say. Ichthy being a Latin word actually for fish, centaur referring to a creature who is half man, half horse. So you put all of that together, you've got a creature who's part fish, part horse, part man. And you can see him here blowing a conch shell for whatever reason. Again, if you look at the images closely, there are two of them. It's said in Greek myth they are brothers. And as you examine them closely in this image, a little bit more up close, you can see that the torso and to the head is that of a man. The two front hind legs, despite that they have arms also, are that of a horse. And then they have a tail very similar to a fish, or in this case, a little bit more mermaid-like. And here's kind of a modern take on how an ichthyocentaur might look. You can see it's got ears and gills, webbed hands, all of these things that are going to be important for a sea creature or part sea creature. And there's not really a lot known about ichthyocentaurs themselves, but again, because we don't have time to cover it all here today, I highly encourage you to delve a little bit further into what they are and some of the stories that they pop up in. Another very fun and fantastical sea creature coming out of Greek mythology is going to be the hippocampus. If you've heard the hippocampus in the brain, where that came from is because it said, if you look at it, it looks a little bit like a figure that is a horse-looking figure. So here are two examples. These are some pieces, once again, from our collection at the Mariners Museum, showing a hippocampus. And yes, it does indeed have the body of a horse. That's where the Greek word hippo means. So a hippopotamus is a river horse. And the campus refers to creature or monster. So this is a horse creature of sorts. Top portion, horse-like, bottom portion, fish-like or mermaid-like. And if you're thinking to yourself, this looks like a creature that I've seen before that's not exactly out of myth and maybe not as large, you are 100% correct that it looks like a seahorse. Now, seahorses aren't very big, so no idea if maybe the seahorse, somebody saw it one day, told this outlandish story of a horse fish looking thing that then grew into this embellished tale of a giant hippocampus or something like that. And for any science people out there, the hippocampus is the genus for the seahorse. Again, a horse-like creature. And it's also got a lot of stories that came out of myth, especially regarding maybe sea creatures and monsters, could have started out with like this kernel of truth. Hey, I saw a horse-like creature. Really grew into, again, this fantastical or outlandish tale that grew and grew until everybody believed this gargantuan sea creature hippocampus out there existed. So that's part of the fun of myth. you never know when a grain of truth might be seated in the story, and or where you can make connections to how you can explain what may or may not have come about from that. So we also have stories of people who were turned into sea creatures, and some of them especially being sea monsters. So we have a couple images here showing two figures. The gentleman who kind of looks like a mermaid, his name is Glaucus, and he was said to have been a fisherman. And here's a quote from a story called The Metamorphoses. And in it, he was telling this woman, her name is Scylla. We're going to look at her story in just a minute. And he's telling her how he was a fisherman, how he would go out with his net and at whatever kind of fishing rod they would have used at the time. And he swept up the fish while he was seated on a rock, or he flung his line out on a rod of sorts, and that's how he made his living. And it said that he was just so in love with what he did, he enjoyed it, and that he wished he could be more in tune with the sea and the waters. And he wound up falling in the waters and thinking he's going to die. Instead, he was a man who got transformed into a merman or mer-like creature. And so he was no longer one who needed to be one with the sea, because he was one with the sea. Now, why is he telling this story? Well, the woman in the picture, her name is Scylla, as I mentioned, and Glaucus loved her. He met her, he saw her sitting on a rock, and he tells her his story, his life story of how he was a fisherman turned into this creature, and he loves the sea and he loves her. Well, a lot of Greek mythology, if you're not familiar with it, is also a little bit tragedy as well. See, there was this witch, as she was called, who loved Glaucus. Glaucus loved Scylla, so there was a little bit of this triangle. And so this sea witch, Circe, got mad at Scylla for having Glaucus's attention when she wanted it. So what did she do? She did what a lot of Greek figures did back then. She cursed Scylla into this hideous kind of gigantic monster, and she slithered away into the rocks, where she would for hundreds of years torment sailors. Scylla became this six-headed creature who lived in the rocks in an area that's now called the Strait of Messina, located between the island country of Sicily and the toe, as I say, of the boot of Italy. So Scylla wasn't bad enough on her own. Scylla also sat directly across from another raging monster called Charybdis, another female figure who had been cursed, and she was transformed into this whirlpool. We're not talking like a little whirlpool that you see when you pull the plug out of your bathtub and it's oh, look at how fun watching the bubbles and everything go down. No, this was a massive whirlpool with teeth that opened up 3 times a day to suck down any unsuspecting sailor or ship who was passing by. So here's the challenge. Scylla and Charybdis are seen in a bunch of different tales, but one of the most famous ones is, again, the Odyssey. Odysseus is trying to make his way home. He started out with about 10 ships. He's now down to just 1, and he's got a crew of 20 some odd people. The challenge when you're sailing past Scylla and Charybdis is that if you get too close to one, Scylla, she's got 6 long heads and necks that can reach out from the rocks and snatch you up. But if you want to avoid her, you're going to get way too close to Charybdis, who's going to open up more than likely, suck you down, and that's it for all of you. Ship and all is going down. So you have this dilemma when you're getting close. Do you sail past Scylla and risk losing only 6 men, 1 per mount? Or do you sail past Charybdis and more than likely lose everything? The ship, the crew, everything in between. And don't know how long it takes to be digested by a hideous whirlpool, but it might not be fun if you think of Star Wars and the sand pit that they call the Sarlacc. I won't get into that. It's an entirely different topic. Typically, you, and as Odysseus did, he sails past Scylla and sacrifices, for lack of a better word, 6 men who unfortunately get snatched up from Scylla and Charybdis. And again, if you're thinking, this sounds kind of like a dilemma where you're between a rock and a hard place, that's more than likely where the saying came from. It used to be the saying was you're caught between Scylla and Charybdis, Scylla being in the rock, Charybdis being a very hard place that you want to avoid or a challenging location. And so this concept of between a rock and a hard place is said to have trickled down over the centuries from stories like the Odyssey, Jason and the Argonauts, who also encountered Scylla and Charybdis, and other sailors who were said to have feared passing through the Strait of Messina. Just in case you're worried, you don't have to worry about Scylla or Charybdis today. If you're ever sailing that way, they are no longer there if they were ever there before. The story or the grain of truth that's said to have come from there is that the Strait of Messina is said to have pretty strong currents, some of which do turn into whirlpools. However, they probably weren't gargantuan or strong enough to actually pull down an entire ship. I'm going to go out on a limb and say they 100% definitely didn't have teeth with them, but I've never been through there. So if you have, please let me know. So looking over here as we move slightly out of the Mediterranean shortly, we have an area called the Strait of Gibraltar. The Mediterranean Sea is not fully landlocked. It's almost completely surrounded by land, save for the sliver of an opening between Morocco in Africa and Spain in Europe. Strait of Gibraltar connects the Mediterranean Sea and it opens out into the Atlantic Ocean, and it's indicated in that little sliver there with the arrow on the screen. You may or may not know that the Strait of Gibraltar also has another name and a story that goes along with how this little opening came about. If you remember back at the beginning, I said that the Greeks once believed that the world, including the Mediterranean Sea, were completely enclosed. So how did this little opening come about? We have somebody who you more than likely have heard of, a very famous hero slash demigod in Greek mythology. His name is Heracles in Greek, but most people know him better as Hercules. And there's the Disney form of him there because I do love a good Disney movie, even if they don't get it right, unfortunately. The Pillars of Hercules are another name for the Strait of Gibraltar. Here's how the story goes. Strongman Hercules had to complete these 12 labors for this king. He had to kill a lion, capture a boar, get some golden apples, a whole bunch of other really crazy things that Hercules had one by one managed to complete, checking them off one by one. When he gets to his 10th out of the 12th labor, he is told that he has to steal cattle, some cows, from a man, for lack of a better word, called Geryon. I will go on and say that Geryon is not just any man. He is described one of two ways. He either has 3 heads, a body and arms, and 3 sets of legs, so 6 legs total, or it said he has 3 heads, 6 arms, 1 body, and 6 sets of legs. He is a massive, very scary creature that nobody really wanted to mess with. So Hercules was tasked with messing with him, and more importantly, stealing his cattle. So Hercules had to go to what was the end of the world known to the Greeks, this area called Erythea. And I've located it there. It is said to have been past what is now the Pillars of Hercules. Well, Hercules gets to this area. He encounters some mountains that he has to go over in order to get to this cattle. But why go over the mountains when you've got superhuman strength? And instead of climbing and taking an arduous journey over the mountains, he uses said strength and just smashes his way through, thus creating an opening through the mountains and thus creating what is now the Strait of Gibraltar, or the Pillars of Hercules as they are called. He then opened up this opportunity for people to leave the Mediterranean Sea by ship in a way that they hadn't thought they were able to before. And he also separated the continents. You now had two divisions, Europe and now Africa to the south. So here's an aerial shot of the Strait of Gibraltar, the Atlantic Ocean over to the west, Morocco to the south, Spain to the north, and then the Mediterranean Sea over to the east. And if you ever do get to go there on the Spanish side, oops, there's a little video of showing Hercules smashing his way through. I forgot that was there. Sorry. If you ever do get to make it to the Spanish side of Gibraltar, there is a statue there showing the strong man and two pillars representing this concept that is the Pillars of Hercules on the Strait of Gibraltar. Sure. Now, as I mentioned, this theme of maritime activity was not, well, it was very important to the Greeks and other cultures as well. But to the Greeks, it didn't just stop above on Earth. It actually trickled down into how they believed in the afterlife. So the underworld, or Hades as it's commonly called, also had its own maritime activity and stories associated with it as well. In the underworld, it is said that there were 5 rivers here, each representing different aspects of the afterlife. So you've got Acheron, the river of woe, Cocytus, the river of lamentation, Phlegethon, excuse me, oops, I hit the wrong button there. I don't think y'all saw that, so that's good. The river of fire, Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, and Styx, which is the river of unbreakable oath. And why it's called the river of unbreakable oath is because it said that anytime the gods on Mount Olympus got into a dispute, or if one was accused of lying, they had to drink from the river Styx. So a god, usually Hermes, the messenger, would go down into the underworld, scoop up a cup of water or a ladle or some other form in which he could take water back up to Mount Olympus, and the god who was being accused of lying had to drink it. If it was found out that he or she was telling the truth, nothing would happen. If it turned out that the god or goddess was in fact lying, he or she wound up losing their power and reign for 100 years. So even the gods weren't above being held accountable, not as often as they probably should have been, if you're familiar with most Greek stories. But the river Styx here is one of those ways and one of those water forms that really kind of, again, held the gods accountable like that. And here's just a modern interpretation, the image on the screen, showing some of how the rivers wove in and out of the underworld and such. And the underworld, or Hades, again, as it's called, was not typically a fun place to go into. And if you died, or when you died, I should say, you couldn't just go there. You had to be ferried across on the river Styx. Styx is also one of my favorite bands from the 80s, but again, that's another program entirely. Charon was the ferryman of the underworld. How the story went is that when you died, your soul, your spirit went down into the underworld. you had to pay a ferryman, Charon, in order to actually be ushered from the banks of the world of the living, or as close as possible in the underworld, over to one of the areas where you were meant to spend eternity. And the underworld did have different kind of levels based on whether you lived your life as a good human or as a bad human, and that's how you would get ferried. So if you've ever seen in movies or film or television shows or anything like that, and you've seen where they place two coins over the eyes of the dead, that is to be the money or payment that the person who died was to give the ferryman Charon so that they could be ferried across. What happens if you die and you weren't given any coinage? You were left to wander on the banks of woe for 100 years before your soul could find rest wherever, before Charon could usher you to the underworld, where you could rest in peace, or if you're unfortunate enough to wind up in Tartarus, one of the deep, dark places where you would rest in torment. Now, you would think, oh, resting on the banks between the world of the living and the dead doesn't sound so bad. But again, it's this concept of not being able to rest in peace. So the spirits would go mad. They would claw at Charon, begging to be able to go. And without that payment, they were just left there. So he played a really important role of ushering the soul from the land of the living to the world of the dead. So just this concept and idea that maritime activity wasn't just limited to the world of the living in Greek culture. And Charon was described, you can see the image on the right, there's a ferryman who's got a little bit more of a Grim Reaper-esque look to him, but he was described more as just a really scraggly but scary looking old man, as you can see in the image on the left, where you can see some of the glowing from the darker portions of the underworld and several images of people who were left on the banks who weren't able to make their way ferried across by Charon. One of the most famous maritime myths that comes out of Greek culture is that of Atlantis. Did it exist? Was it real? If it did, where did it go? There are a lot of people who have searched for this idea of Atlantis. What was it? Why did it sink? There's a lot of theories. And where did the story of Atlantis even really come from? If you've heard of a gentleman, or if you haven't, there was a scholar, for lack of a better term, named Plato, who lived back in ancient Greece. He left behind stories initially of Atlantis that then got retold, and they got retold not just in Greek culture, but carried on to Egyptian culture and Roman culture until this idea of Atlantis, this lost city, this very great empire once existed. And Plato had said that it had existed after the time Heracles had pushed past the Strait of Gibraltar, the Pillars of Hercules, as we call them, and that this great island nation or empire in a lot of ways existed on an island right past those pillars. So where I've located or indicated with the green marker on the screen there. Now, Atlantis was said to have been the superpower who went in and conquered much of the known world before the Romans did it themselves. So much of Europe, much of parts of Asia, and it's said to have been massive, even larger than parts of Europe. I don't know how big this island would have been, that it would have sank, and then we can't find anything if it was that large, but I'm no Atlantis scholar, so who knows, it could still be out there. What is said to have happened is that the gods never liked to be rivaled with. Again, you never want to anger any of the gods. And as Atlantis grew into this superpower, it said that they also became immortal as well. So now you're kind of stepping into godlike territory. You have captured most of the known world, or you're ruling it, and you're intelligent. You're an intelligent people and all this other stuff. So the gods, the Greek gods, decided they can't have that. And so Poseidon is said to have sent an earthquake or a tsunami or some type of great catastrophic event toward Atlantis that eventually caused them to sink. Again, here's a map. Really quickly, this is based off of Plato's description as to where Atlantis could have been. And what you're looking at here, this is an old Egyptian map based off of Plato's work. And it might look a little funky. That's because it's what's called a southern facing map. So the lettering is right side up, but you might notice that Europe is towards the bottom versus Africa being on top. And then America over to the other side there. So north is actually, if you look at the arrow down toward the bottom of the island, that arrow that looks like it's pointing down is actually pointing to north. And it's just this representation of this great island that Plato was said to have described that lived past the Strait of Gibraltar in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, or at least off to the side of Europe. And this was said to have been the nation of Atlantis. And as Plato describes in his work, highly encourage you to read it or find some synopsis of it, because he tells of how Atlantis was this great city, this great empire, these great people and such, and how at the end of it all, in a single day and night of misfortune, that all of the men, all of their buildings sank down into the earth, and the island that we now know as Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea. I don't know if Atlantis exists. There's a part of me who hopes it does, because that would be awesome. There are scholars and historians and archaeologists and just people who are obsessed with the story who have gone out looking and have their own theories as to what Atlantis was and where it could be and what could have even happened to it. There's also this understanding that Atlantis may have existed, maybe just not in the way that Plato described, again, in that slightly embellished fashion, and that maybe it was an island nation or civilization who, like many that came before it, were unfortunate, and whether it was a volcanic eruption or an earthquake or some catastrophic event, as I mentioned, wound up causing the island to founder down into the ocean, and maybe whatever was left of it has just been lost over time. This was not a new concept. There are islands in Greece that we know civilizations are lost to us because of flooding or tsunami or earthquake. Even if you think of Pompeii and the volcanic eruption that wiped out that entire civilization, it's completely possible or plausible that some Atlantean nation or group of people may have existed, maybe had a different name, maybe not in the way that we know them as, but just reiterating this idea that there may be kernels of truth in all of these stories that we refer to as mythology that sound a little bit, again, outlandish, or well, I highly doubt that happened, or just however you may take it. A lot of it does sometimes have a little bit of kernel of truth. And what's fun about mythology, as we kind of wrap up here, is whether or not it's true, like the Pillar of Hercules, a strong man breaking his way through it, it's fun to think about. And it's really creative for a culture who was a little bit ahead of its time, who maybe couldn't determine how the Strait of Gibraltar was created on its own, yet came up with this possible way that it may have happened that then became the story that we now tell thousands of years later. So with that, that is this presentation looking at the ancient waters of the Greeks, the myths, tales, and legends that have come out of it. I can tell you this is just a tiny fraction of so many great stories, not just out of Greek and Roman culture, but again, as I mentioned, other cultures across the globe have their concepts and understandings of different aspects of the world, their own stories as to who they were or how things came about. And some are similar, some are different. They're all, in my opinion, fun. Some are exciting too. Some are a little crazy, some get a little dark, but I guess that's really any great story out there. So with that, our time is wrapping up, but I am happy to answer any questions or any feedback or comments if there are any before we sign off here. We've got about 10 minutes and such, but yeah.
Thank you so much for presenting. That was fantastic. It was so interesting.
Are there any questions out there? I believe we've got the chat bar, which I'm more than happy to respond to. And I am not the most tech savvy, I will say that, but I believe there's usually a little hand raising if you wanted to unmute yourself. And what I'll do is I'll actually stop sharing so I can show my face if anybody wants to. But I don't see any questions or comments or such. They said thank you for hosting this talk. And yes, thank you to the Hampton Public Library for inviting the Mariners Museum and Park. We love coming here. Again, if you haven't visited the Mariners Museum, we are located in Newport News, just off of Warwick Boulevard. And yes, it is only $1 to come in and see us. Thank you for Russell, who says I have an excellent background on myths. If you need any recommendations for books or stories or websites, I'm going to type in my email down here, and anyone is more than welcome to contact me directly via my email. This is my work email. Again, I do have a background in classical studies and Greek mythology, to be specific. So I'm always happy to, as I say, nerd out. So I can rein it in too, but I am always happy to nerd out or just offer some great resources that you can look at. But is there anything you'd like to say before I sign off?
No, I think that's all I got. Question for you. What's your favorite Greek myth, especially like the sea?
Oh, okay. So I was asked if anybody didn't hear what my specifically Greek maritime myth is. And one of my favorite stories, it's actually a book. It's an underrated book in my opinion, so I apologize in advance. It's called the Aeneid. The Aeneid, if anybody is not familiar, is kind of a tertiary or third part to the Trojan War story. You've got the Iliad that tells the story of the Trojan War. You've got the Odyssey, which tells of Odysseus, who fought for the Greeks. The Aeneid tells of a Trojan warrior, a Trojan prince, and a group of Trojans who escaped Troy. And he was destined to found what later becomes Rome. So he is like the greatest ancestor of what eventually becomes Rome. And in that story, you encounter a group of people called the Phoenicians or the Carthaginians. And there's war in there. And part of the reason I love that story so much is a little because it's underrated, but it is just such a great tale and gives you a slightly different perspective of the Trojan War from the Trojan side. So that is the Aeneid. If you hadn't heard of that and are familiar with the Trojan War, I do have a couple questions, recommendations for diverse myths and book recommendations. Edith Hamilton's book is the first one I was actually going to mention. So yes, Edith Hamilton's mythology is a great place to start. Hesiod's, I'm actually going to type it here. Let me make sure I spell it right. The Theogony here by Hesiod is a great book that is it's a short book too, and it tells you the creation story of the Greek gods, goddesses, the Titans, and all the creatures out of it. Another great one is the metamorphoses. And some of these were on that image screen that I had shown. The beauty of the metamorphoses is that it is essentially a compilation of Roman myths. So in there, you'll see the Roman counterpart names. So instead of Zeus, you'll see Jupiter. Instead of Hera, you'll see Juno. But the stories are very similar to those that had initially come out of Greek mythology as well. So those are some great places to start, just to get a basis or understanding of it. And if you go to places like Barnes and Noble, even Amazon, there are dozens, and I have dozens of them, so I know this for a fact. Dozens of books on both Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and even just mythology as a whole that incorporate cultures from across the globe, as I mentioned. So those 3 books that are in the chat are great to start. I've got all of them. I've read all of them, and I enjoyed all of them, among others. So yes, and the library. Please come to the library. Any library, local. Yes. Thank you, Easter. You can't beat that, because obviously with the library card, you can check books out and get to enjoy them. And that's much better than necessarily spending money if you're not even sure how you'll react, or if you even want to know more about it. So yes, thank you for that. Shame on me for not even saying that first. I'm so sorry. But with that, please feel free to write down my email, contact me directly if there's any other questions, comments, feedback, or contact the library directly, and they can get a hold of us as well. And thank you so much for attending. I hope you not only maybe learned a little bit, but enjoyed it as well. Again, I can nerd out on this all day long. I think I have before. So with that, I will spare you all and send you on your way to enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much. And we'll see you soon. Thank you.